Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give everybody a chance to come aboard, so we'll just wait a minute while folks get into the webinar. But welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome in. And I'm just watching our numbers go up. So just waiting a moment before we start for everyone to get into the webinar. All right. We've got a wonderful group here this afternoon, and I do want to welcome all of you to our presentation today, Exploring Black History in New Jersey, New Research and Discoveries. My name is Sarah Curitan, and I'm proud to be the Executive Director of the New Jersey Historical Commission, and I'm particularly proud to present this program to you this afternoon. Let me mention that I'm joined today behind the scenes by another member of our staff, a highly valued member, Greer Luce. She's going to be our webmaster this afternoon. So many thanks to Greer. You'll meet her a little bit later on when she helps with our question and answer session. Let me let you know that today's session will be recorded. So do keep that in mind. We're expecting a robust attendance this afternoon. And we do want to invite you to use the chat to introduce yourself. We'd love to hear from you and just get a better idea of who's with us this afternoon. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And then if you do have questions, we would love to hear them. Please enter your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar down there at the bottom. And we will be taking questions at the end of all the presentations this afternoon. So I did want to begin today by just tipping our hat to Carter G. Woodson, often referred to as the father of Black history. Of course, he has so many credits to his name, among them founding the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, an organization that continues to this day doing excellent work, and also to introducing all of us to what became Black History Month. And we're so glad to contribute to this year's marking of Black History Month. As Carter G. Woodson said, it is an effort to bring that critical history to life in one's imagination. And by doing that is to walk with giants. So this afternoon, we have a welcome from our Secretary of State, Tahisha Way Esquire. We're so grateful that she was able to offer a welcome this afternoon. Her support for history and the arts has been invaluable, and we're delighted to have a welcome from Secretary Way this afternoon.
On behalf of my colleagues at the New Jersey Department of State, including the New Jersey Historical Commission led by Sarah Curitan, I'm pleased to welcome you to Exploring Black History in New Jersey, New Research and Discoveries, a program highlighting an amazing series of projects that seek to research, interpret, and share African American history in the Garden State. I wish we could gather together in person, but I am hopeful that this virtual format allows more folk to have access to this great program. Today, we will hear from speakers representing the 313 Project at the Siloam Hope First Presbyterian Church in Elizabeth, the Monmouth County Historical Association, and the Scarlet and Black Project at Rutgers University. Their work, uncovering the stories of African Americans in New Jersey, is helping to recenter our collective understanding of the past. The Monmouth County Historical Association, along with the Enslaved African Memorial Project in Teaneck, were recipients of the New Jersey Historical Commission project grants, and both received the 2021 Giles Wright Award designation for excellence in African American history. Inspired by the great scholars, historians, and educators who have shepherded the study of Black history into the 21st century, New Jersey is home to many organizations and projects currently engaged in exploring underrepresented stories. From the brand new Harriet Tubman Museum in Cape May, highlighting the legacy of the Underground Railroad, to the 2020 Newark Public Library's exhibition showcasing the voices of Black women in the fight for women's suffrage, there is much to learn in New Jersey. Despite the challenges of the past year, the state's history practitioners have persisted in their work. Scholars Beverly Mills and Elaine Buck were featured in a 2020 New York Times article discussing their decade-long research on African American communities in the Saraland Mountain region. Moreover, their findings were published in a 2018 book entitled If These Stones Could Talk. Additionally, the Sankofa Collaborative, the organizations dedicated to helping individuals in schools, museums, and libraries discuss African American history, pivoted in 2020 to offer virtual programs relevant to current events. And this spring, Sankofa is offering a series of virtual programs about inequalities in the American healthcare system. In closing, today's speakers and organizations are just some of the many who are making Black history increasingly more accessible in New Jersey. Events like today allow us to learn not only about their research, but about their process. So, how can we too explore and celebrate Black history? I hope that you will join me in keeping this important question top of mind this month and every month of the year. And please welcome our speakers for what I know will be a fantastic program.
Thank you again, Secretary Way. As I mentioned, we are so grateful for her leadership and support, both at the Historical Commission and at the Arts Council and throughout the Department of State. And now for our program. Now, I'm particularly excited today to present to you these three projects because they really demonstrate the new, innovative, and really groundbreaking research that's going on right in our own state. And so it's with great pleasure that we are going to present three projects currently underway in New Jersey in Black history. And the first of those is the 313 Project. And to present and tell us much more about that project, we are delighted to have Reverend Dr. Wanda Lundy with us today. She is the new pastor of Shalom Hope First Presbyterian Church in historic Elizabeth, New Jersey, where she is uncovering the untold stories of 313 freed and enslaved Africans buried in the church cemetery in unmarked graves. So, Pastor Lundy, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. You are welcome. It is my honor to share with you about the 313 plus research project about our ancestors who are buried in unmarked graves at the First Presbyterian Church, now known as Siloam Hope First Presbyterian Church. In order to do so, I would like to share with you a video that was presented at a conference in October. I think it will give you an overview of what we are seeking to do. It's called Rituals of Resistance, Evidence of Resiliency, Faith in the Time of COVID-19 and Resistance. This was presented at the Afro-American Genealogical and Historical Society Conference. I would like to share it with you now. Blessings, and thank you for the opportunity to introduce the African ancestors, men, women, and children who lived in Elizabeth, New Jersey, beginning in 1664. Elizabethtown, established in 1664, was the first English-speaking settlement in New Jersey and the first seat of colonial government for the state. The province's first appointed governor, Philip Carteret, arrived in the region on the ship Philip in 1664 and stepped ashore at Elizabethtown beside the Arthur Kill, a tidal strait separating New Jersey from Staten Island. From the very beginning, European settlers used and depended upon enslaved African labor force to work their plantations. Governor Carteret and his 12 followers arrived with 18 African men servants, slaves, because they added value to their land grants. Governor Carteret also brought with him the concessions and agreement of the Lords Proprietors of New Caesarea, New Jersey, which was the constitution governing the establishment of New Jersey. The document was important to the introduction of African slaves into East Jersey. The original 84 English families settling in the region were encouraged to bring servants and slaves with offers of an additional 150 acres for each slave and 75 acres for weaker servant slaves more than 14 years old. Bonded servants could get 75 acres after their bondage servitude ended. This is found in Union County Black Americans, FOM, Washington. As you can hear, documented in Union County Black Americans by Ethel Washington, our ancestors were here from the beginning of the establishment of New Jersey. Also, take note of the fact that the more enslaved Africans the European settlers brought, the more land they were given. The church I serve as pastor of is Siloam Hope First Presbyterian Church. This is a recently merged congregation that includes First Presbyterian Church. To give you further context, I'll now show you a short video about the church campus that includes the cemeteries where our ancestors now rest.
Welcome back to Jersey Matters. We're taping on a rainy day in Lakewood, New Jersey. Hey, did you know that Elizabeth, not Trenton, was the first capital of New Jersey? And it wasn't named after Queen Elizabeth, but Elizabeth Carteret, who was a wealthy landowner in colonial times. That city has so much history. And now our Vanessa Tyler reveals a bit of history that many thought would stay buried.
Larry, there is so much history in plain sight, often overlooked, like this graveyard behind the First Presbyterian Church on Broad Street in Elizabeth. Here lies those who shaped New Jersey and the spirit of America.
This is the most historic cemetery in the state of New Jersey.
The headstones here prove it. Time may have worn away many names. Walking through this graveyard is like walking through history. On this day, a tour of the cemetery and the bold-faced names of history. There are others here, not so famous, but whose lives are just as valuable to be remembered.
So please join me in welcoming Sean Grant.
It all started with the curious Sean Brighty, a Brown University student who began with a class project on genealogy and ended up going deeper into the ground.
I combed through all of the records from 1840 to 1902.
On the grounds of the Presbyterian Church behind the cemetery in the equally historic Snyder Academy building, an audience invited by the Old First Historic Trust, the organization that oversees the grounds here. Sean told them what he learned as he was trying to find the plots of his own family members buried in that centuries-old cemetery. His research into the church's old burial records unveiled 5,000 bodies buried, and about 2,000 markers are here. But what is really surprising, over in the far corner, chained off in the segregated section called the island, records show graves are missing.
That hundreds of these unmarked African-American burials lie in that corner under what's now the church parking lot.
What Sean uncovered was many of the graves are well covered, paved over by a driveway. The area built up around it includes the Union County Courthouse and a multi-story garage. Here lies early African Americans, both slave and free.
You get individuals who actually own substantial amounts of property, which is very rare for an African American of the mid-19th century. The cemetery itself goes back to the late 1600s, but the earliest marked African American grave we have is 1840. And there are only 5 marked African American graves out of the over 350 African American individuals buried there. Is the stone for Lafayette Boylston, the one that actually labels him as colored, which is really what started the whole examination of this part for me.
Just the sheer number of unmarked graves, that some of those really might still be under the current driveway, and that was really, really surprising. So we do hope that we will have the funding available over the near future to be able to memorialize some of those people who are unmarked and not named, but we'd like to do that.
Well, I didn't realize that here at the Presbyterian Church in Elizabeth, New Jersey, that there was a large number of African Americans who were church members, worshiped, and are buried on the grounds here. And that we can honor them and hopefully look for a way of honoring them, and that when you call their names, they're remembered. The stories do not continue to be told, and it's so exciting that this young man has taken the time and brought forth this information that we can now honor those who are unnamed and those who have been a part of these communities.
As for Sean, he started the project looking for his relatives.
I found my family in the book originally.
Last name Tuckers, some listed as Tukers.
I have a family connection to Elizabethtown. My ancestors actually were some of the original founders.
So it appears he continues his family line of discovery. In Elizabeth, I'm Vanessa Tyler for Jersey Net.
I'm standing in the location that our ancestors had to worship from. They worshiped in the balcony that was designated for them. Enslaved and free Africans were members of a congregation. According to church manual, 20 Black members in 1824, 39 years before Emancipation Proclamation. And later manuals show that more than 60 joined over the next 50 years. This information is found in church manuals dated 1824, 1858, 1868. Our ancestors were buried in the cemetery. I am told that some of our ancestors were actually buried with their owners. The only gravestone is dated 1849 that signifies that an ancestor is buried in the cemetery. And it has the abbreviation COL''D in the corner of the stone, signifying this person was colored. Alexander Hamilton attended school at the academy on our campus. This is the academy that Alexander Hamilton went to school at when he came to the United States. Record states that he walked in the cemetery between classes studying on this campus, that he was often seen sitting under a tree in the cemetery. This could have been the tree. This tree is over 300 years old. Surely our ancestors were an eyewitness to these accounts. What might they have been doing? We know the story of Alexander Hamilton. We want to tell the story of our ancestors. I'm standing in the area where most of our ancestors are buried in unmarked graves. It was almost exactly 1 year to the day ago in October 19th, 2019, at a 4 Centuries in a Weekend event sponsored by the Union County Office of Cultural and Heritage Affairs, I was introduced to the ancestors who are resting in the cemetery in Elizabeth, New Jersey. In thinking of the focus of the conference, rituals of resistance, evidence of resiliency, faith in the time of COVID-19 and resistance, it is my strong belief that the resistance and resiliency of our ancestors interred in the cemetery at First Presbyterian Church is their determination that they not be forgotten. That is what I believe their resistance and their resiliency is. They want their names called. They don't want to be forgotten. And I also believe that they want to help us to do the work that we are called to do today. So what we have been doing over the last month is working on a monument, a design of a monument that will go in this very spot to remember, to honor our ancestors. And it is my pleasure to show that to you today. We invite you to join us as we remember our ancestors and as we listen as the ancestors speak. Thank you. Thank you very much for paying attention to our journey as we listen to our ancestors speak. And now we call our project the 313 plus, because there's a potential that there are 384 even more of our ancestors. That's part of the work that we will embark upon as we do the research. We look forward to talking with you about this project and hope that you will join us as we do this research, as we listen to the ancestors speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pastor Lundy. And I'm sure I speak for all of us in expressing great appreciation that you showed us. You actually, even in our virtual world, gave us pictures and images of the cemetery and the site. That was truly a treat. And by the way, we already have some questions coming in, and we will get to those, as I mentioned, after all our speakers have presented. Our second speaker is Joe Zamla. Joe currently serves as the Associate Curator for the Monmouth County Historical Association. He and his colleagues recently founded the Living and Breathing Initiative, with a focus on reinterpreting MCHA's colonial-era historic house museums to include the stories of the enslaved African Americans who lived and worked at the 4 properties. So Joe, we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. I'm just gonna let's see. Okay, let's go back. So as Sarah was saying, Monmouth County Historical Association started an initiative titled Living and Breathing, and we are going to be reinterpreting our historic houses. We have 4 18th century historic homes to include the stories of the enslaved. And we've got a lot of great partners helping from around the state with that initiative. So I'm going to start this today talking about one of those houses, Marlpit Hall. Marlpit Hall is an 18th century home built around 1756. What I want to do today is talk about the lives of the enslaved who lived there, what we know about them, what we don't know about them, and then how we are trying to fill in some of those gaps. Okay, so like I said, Marlpit Hall is a farmhouse built around 1756. It was on one of the original housing lots of Middletown. The early history is very fuzzy, but from about 1771 on, we do know that it was owned by the Taylor family. First and foremost, Edward Taylor, who purchased the home. Like many 18th century homes, the Taylors had enslaved Africans working on site. So through documentation, we've identified at least 10 that were on site from the year 1783 till the 1830s. And this is primarily through inventories, wills, manumission records. I put a few of them up here. If you look on the left, you can see that's an 1818 inventory of John Taylor, the owner of the home, listing the enslaved up top. And then below that, it lists the contents of the kitchen chamber, so the large attic room right above the kitchen where the enslaved would have slept and stayed. On the right is a farm ledger, again from John Taylor, from Marlpit Hall, that lists the births of 3 enslaved from 1804 and 1806. So we're, in some ways, we're fortunate to have these types of records through papers, documents that kind of give us these statistics. Of course, the problem with this is that this is an uninformed outlook in terms of the lives of the enslaved. What the records do really is reflect the white perspective, and so we get kind of the static view of slavery, that it becomes uniform through space and time, which is not the case. I put this one up here as an example of that because I think it kind of shows what I'm referring to here. This is a 1798 federal slave tax from Middletown Township, New Jersey. It was only one of 2 produced in New Jersey, so it's not very common. And it's a little bit different than the standard tax record in that this document only recorded slaves that were considered taxable. So in New Jersey at the time, that would mean slaves that were male, over 16, under 50 years of age, sound body, and fit to work. So you can see it where I highlighted, again, John Taylor down near the bottom there. The column in the middle there says he had 6 enslaved total. However, 4 of those were exempt from taxation, so only 2 were subject to tax. And you see, if you go down this list, you can see there's quite a large discrepancy between the total number of enslaved and those that were considered taxable. So if you look at the tax rateables from this period, you'll find that about half of the slaveholders in the county would not show up on the tax rateable as owning slaves because they were not, some of these slaves were not considered taxable. So it's just a prime example of that biased record we get from these documents. Here's a couple shots of Marlpit Hall. There's one on the left from 1895 or around then, and the one on the right more present. So this home dates to 1756. Like I said, it was owned by the Taylors from 1771 all the way up until 1931, when Mary Holmes Taylor was the last of that family line to own the house. In 1935, it was purchased for restoration. It was donated to MCHA for preservation, and that was primarily through the efforts of Margaret Haskell. In 1919, the house was actually relocated about 100 feet because of a road alignment project of Kings Highway. So that photo on the left from 1895 is not the exact same spot as the photo on the right. Got moved, if you if you're on Kings Highway now, the original would be on the other side of the street. So I mentioned before in the inventory, we know where the former enslaved quarters were. So these are some present day views and what they look like now. And you'll see a lot of the 18th century architectural fabric remains. So these quarters are really not that much different than they would have looked at the time. Much of the house, especially the first floor, had to undergo significant restoration. There was at the time it hadn't been lived in quite a number of years. So there was floors had to be rebuilt, walls taken down. On the second floor, however, some of these attic rooms pretty much remained as is. So they were not didn't have to be altered or repaired. Of course, over the years, certain things like a roof replacement was necessary, lighting was installed, an HVAC system for preservation. But other than that, you'll see a lot of the original bones here. And this is right above the kitchen of the home. That bottom corner picture there, you can see the staircase that leads up to these quarters from the old kitchen. Okay, so in 1999, there were some renovations at the house, and some of the workers discovered a clamshell and a corn cob underneath the doorway to the slave quarters. So this led to some speculation that these could be related to African religious practices. Of course, one clamshell and one corn cob are not quite enough to make that assumption, but it was the first time that at least in the context of MCHA houses, that something like this had been discovered. So, and the work in general, revolving around these types of discoveries and practices, was only a few decades old. The first excavation of an African-American slave quarter was not until 1968. So there was not much data, and the data that was there was primarily outside of this context. It really wasn't until the late 1970s that archaeology started to kind of converge with anthropology, social history, and other fields, start putting some of these items into context. Okay, once archaeologists and others started to kind of take this new approach, excavations began to reveal material lives that of the enslaved that were not quite expected. So what they expected was that there was going to be meager possessions, not much retention of an African culture. When they started looking at these things, however, from a different perspective, they found that there was, in fact, things that were not categorized in the typical archaeological fashion. So basically, pattern recognition in archaeology was a way of to separate things into functional or material objects, which can tell you a lot, but it's not always related to culture. Once they began focusing on African-American retentions, however, and turning to anthropology, to folklore, to linguistics, African-American culturalists, a lot of these objects that were originally deemed unclassifiable started to make more sense. And you can see these assemblages that were discovered kind of all over the country, mainly down south, but a few plantations in the north, and they were labeled as concealed assemblages. And these were typically found in places like under floorboards, in the walls, in the entryways, in the hearth, concealed spaces, but also spaces that were significant in that they were near entranceways and exitways to the room. And as expected, there were very few objects that were actually brought from Africa, although a few shells and such items were discovered. But there was evidence of modified traditions that were adapting to this West African. The West African culture was adapting to these new belongings. So the beliefs and ideas about protection and healing that came from West Africa were now showing up modified in these new possessions. So all of a sudden, speculation was that these were ritual concealments, African charms, engraved symbols reflecting African spirituality. They were finding things like shells, pierced coins, ceramic shards, beads, small bones, things that were previously just kind of either discarded or not categorized in any cultural meaningful way. So here we have a few examples from the Ladding's 100 site in New York, Barclay's Plantation in Kentucky, and the Carroll House in Maryland. And there's also one from the Lott House in New York. Incised objects or engraved objects, they've started to pop up at a lot of these sites. Again, in Georgia, Maryland, Virginia, a lot of southern sites, a few in New York. Primarily, what archaeologists were finding was objects incised with some form of an X or a cross mark. There was speculation as to what this actually meant. Some people said it was maybe some kind of identification. Was it some kind of mark of possession, marking your possessions, or was it more of a cultural thing? Immediately, the shift started to turn towards the Congo, Kingdom of Congo region of Africa, which had a large spiritual presence, devoted a lot to the Congo cosmogram, which is a similar symbol. It's a sort of a circle. I'm going to show it in just a minute, but it's a circle with a cross in it. But it can be adapted into an X or small cross. So the going theory was that that's what they were finding, is these X marks incised to mark the cosmogram. Okay, that's an interpretation of the cosmogram on the left, which is a symbol, but it's really more of a philosophy for how the Congo tribe lived. It represents the continuity of life and kind of the divide between the spiritual and the living worlds. So this was a very important philosophical and spiritual emblem for for African Americans in the New World. The Kingdom of Congo, as you can see on the right there, was that's overlapped over present day boundaries, but it was an area where there were many millions of enslaved were taken from. So it was that kind of central West Africa region. And the Congo influence extended outside of that kingdom. So you could really find it up north and east as well. In 1983, Robert Farris Thompson published Flash of the Spirit, African and Afro-American Art and Philosophy. This was kind of a groundbreaking book, in meaning that it really shed new light on these types of symbols that no one had spent a good deal of time, at least in the United States, in this context, dealing with and kind of interpreting. So this is one of the main reasons, along with archaeologists like Chris Ferguson and some others, that were started comparing all of these signs and symbols to the Congo cosmogram. Like I said, most of the evidence was found in the South, and there's a couple reasons why. Southern plantations, typically you would have these complexes of enslaved homes, so these small, meager huts that were either a single hut or sometimes in groups. The homes themselves were mostly destroyed over time, but the sites could be excavated. So archaeologists could go in and kind of pinpoint where these sites were and do their excavations. In the North, you had the problems of urbanization and development. And so it's very rare for an 18th century home to still be standing. And most of the ones that are either heavily renovated or they've been altered to a point where you can't gain too much information about the past from it. Also, the things that we're finding were things of sort of small significance if you're not looking into that context of spirituality. So a lot of these things could have been found over the years and then discarded. In the Northeast, pretty much the entire body of archaeological evidence, at least according to some archaeologists, was limited to the Beverwyck Estate in Morris County, New Jersey, and the Van Cortlandt Manor in the Bronx. Okay, and then around the same time as the corn cob and the clamshell were discovered at Marl Pit, at the Lott House in Brooklyn in about 1999 or 2000, they made some pretty major discoveries. So this is a 1719 Dutch farmhouse in Brooklyn, and they discovered not only artifacts, but the slave quarters themselves that had been kind of hidden off in a through a secret passage to an attic way for nearly 200 years. So when they were doing work on this home for 2 or 3 years before they even realized that there were slave quarters still intact in the house. So obviously when they entered these quarters, it was like stepping into a time capsule. They could really see these quarters as they were, and they were immediately started doing excavation work to see what they could find. So underneath the floorboards, what they found was a lot of things that were similar to sites they were finding in the South. So caches of shells, they were finding small bones, some wrapped in cloth, similar to the Congo in Kisi, which is like a power object. They found corn cobs arranged purposefully. And again, it was theorized that these represented the Congo cosmogram. And you can see in the New York Times cited that these findings were significant proof that African spiritual practices had survived the period of slavery, not only in the Deep South, but as far as north as New York City, which was contrary to anyone's prior belief. Okay, so fast forwarding again to 2020, this is again Margaret Hall in Middletown. This cited the original corn cob and clam shells that were found in 1999. So if you look at the doorway going into the slave quarters, there's some space underneath where it's fairly, you can't access it, but you can kind of peer into it and see with a flashlight or cell phone or whatnot. So this is a photo of another clamshell, another corn cob that were found. Again, in and of itself does not necessarily say that this is anything meaningful, but when you take it in the context of everything that was, all the evidence and literature that had come out previously since the first discovery, it certainly opened up doorways and invited more exploration. So what was found in the slave quarters themselves was possible concealed caches of ceramic shards, clam shells, painted glass fragments, and jawbones. Now, if you look up in the top left corner there, that's the site where I had uncovered all of these objects that you see on the screen. They were kind of encased in dirt and dust and brick at this point, but they were all together in one spot. And they were, in fact, within right where the wooden floor meets the hearth. So again, that's significant location of the hearth. These were, if you look on the lower right there, those are two small jawbones, about 10 or 12 ceramic shards, mostly of blue, some green colors. On the left there, very small fragments of painted glass. And I put one photo of a clamshell up there. There was, I think there was 2 total within that kind of little area there. Further investigation yielded more findings. So underneath the floorboards, there were a variety of bones. 2 of the bones were nestled into the hearth itself, kind of into the brickwork. The small vertebrae on the left, which we believe came from either a cow or a pig, was found underneath the floorboard. The larger bone was found on top of the hearth, and then some of the smaller bones were mainly under the floorboards. They were not all together, they were dispersed, but they were certainly concealed. And again, old bones in an old house is not necessarily indicative of anything, but again, when you look at the context of other findings and what they were using these for, coupled with the other ceramics and concealed objects, it does start to kind of paint a picture of the spirituality of practice. And if you look at the WPA 1930s projects where they interviewed formerly enslaved people, you really get a lot of, and those are in the Library of Congress if you ever want to read through the transcripts, but you get a lot of information that doesn't always translate through the textbooks and the history books. So those are first-person accounts. And you can see the quote here: "The only charms that were worn were made out of bones." And if you read through those accounts, you do see a lot of reference to charms, to conjuring, to hoodoo, things like that. So definitely an interesting perspective. Not necessarily from New Jersey. There are interviews from all over the country, mainly down south. Within the brick and the wood lathing of the walls, there was small pieces of fabric. These were identified to be late 18th, early 19th century pieces of fabric. Especially significant on the left, there is that kind of strip of brown corduroy that was identified as a piece of a knee breech that would have been worn by a male during that time. And I don't know if it's visible in the photograph, but you can actually see a small buttonhole sewn into the top of one of those ends. So that was the only piece we could identify for sure of where that came from. Again, I can't say for sure that this was an enslaved person wearing this, but these were concealed in the walls in the slave quarters of the home, and they're from the time that the slaves were living there. Various theories as to why these could be there. I mean, there's certainly one approach is that possessions were meager, and the enslaved had to kind of tuck away these objects like this just for everyday practical use, and that certainly is possible. If you compare it to other sites and other explanations, again, I'm not trying to say these are necessarily my opinions, but some people compare or kind of compare the use of clothing and cloth into those charm bags and which would be filled with some kind of organic material or roots and kind of tied up and concealed and placed into the walls or under the floorboards. So while there's no direct evidence of that, I'm gonna skip ahead here to, this is just another look at that linen lined corduroy with the buttonhole, a little bit of a closer look. On the right there is what the original garment most likely would have looked like. Okay, so on the left, you can see an example of a Congo nkisi, which is made of a corded raffia cloth. It's unwrapped. Again, this is from Thompson's Flesh of the Spirit. So this was filled with shells, with other organic materials, things like roots and herbs. And if you kind of compare it to that cloth on the right, you could kind of make the case for that being a similar looking garment. Of course, like I said, there's no direct evidence saying that this was in fact that, but just to kind of explore all theories. One of the next discoveries at the house was corn cobs. Similar to the Lot House, there was no direct evidence in the text of corn cobs having significant meaning to these spiritual practices, but what the researchers were finding were that they were aligned in certain patterns or certain ways that again resembled those cross marks or the X or the cosmogram or whatever they were whatever they were identifying. So these on the left here are actually corn cobs found in the floorboard of Marplet Hall. On the right, you can see the floorboard lifted, and it's quite a lot of space down there. It's almost like a little compartment that's about 2 feet down to the floor where these corn cobs were found. And then comparing them to the ones at the Lot House in Brooklyn, you can see that similar shape on the left, the ones at the Lot House in Brooklyn, forming that cross shape. And then on the right is Marplet Hall. Appears to be one at the top, two horizontally forming the center line, and then there was none at the bottom. And while others were found in the area dispersed, we could not say for sure if it was part of this ensemble or not. So, but you can kind of, if you compare those two shapes, they're certainly very similar. On the doorway leading into the slave quarters, there's very light incised cross marks. And this is a widespread sign within the African diaspora. It has multiple origins. I mentioned before about people relating this to the Congo cosmogram. That was kind of the early theory and still is prevalent within some modes of thought. But based on those early books that kind of link the cosmogram to this shortened X or cross mark, right now, though, the research is showing that there's so many origins to this cross mark, and while it is an important symbol within multiple African cultures, it might be unfair at this point to assert a geographically specific region to this symbol. You'll see this marked or referred to as an X, the 4 points, the crossroads, the cross mark. It's really this intersection of a visible and invisible world, an interplay of spirit worlds. And basically, you see this a lot in terms of a protection, right, or invoking ancestral spirits. And so the enslaved were all tied to these African roots, but there were so many different various cultures, beliefs, and circumstances that it's hard to say for sure that it probably is not fair to pinpoint these cross marks as coming from one specific spot. And having said that, it was the people who originally labeled these as symbols of the cosmogram. That was really a groundbreaking type of observation, in that it was the first time that people started to look at these symbols in that context and not just not just ignored. So while these may not be precisely that, it's that context that really opened the door to a lot more interpretation. And like I said, this cross mark symbol kind of goes back very long ways. You can see that 14th century rock art from the lower Congo region, and it's still seen today within the descendants of many African cultures. In the middle there, 20th century sculpture of a mother and child. At the bottom there, right along the base, there's those incised X marks all around it. And you see that a lot in even in modern African art. The 17th century Kingdom of the Congo flag on the right, you can see is an obvious cross mark representation. And then a couple more modern representations of the cross that you still see with throughout the South, and mostly the South, but it trickles into the North as well. And so with all these different origins and cultures, it's very hard to pinpoint these signs as basically coming from one place or evolving from one spot. This is kind of these are different signs, but showing that this cross mark is a common symbol, but kind of maintains different cultural meanings depending on where it's found and how it's used. This is a little bit off topic, but just to show that these kind of carvings in the wood, they're not specific to this type of research or interpretation. It's actually quite common if you look in 17th century homes to find these types of markings. These are the ones shown here are called apotropaic marks, sometimes called witch marks. 17th century Europe, New England, you'll see these a lot during that kind of witch hysteria. And they're commonly carved into wooden beams, and again found in the same kind of threshold areas above doorways, things like that. And in fact, in 2015, they discovered more than 80 of these carved into the wooden rafters at the Queen's House in the Tower of London. But just kind of shows you that while the symbols change, the meanings change, a lot of these kind of different practices are rooted in different cultures, different religions. They do overlap. And also things like concealed objects in walls, shoes in walls was very popular among the same group. And actually mummified cats are often found in walls from these types of homes. So heavily put there to protect against evil spirits, which is and that heavily died out of favor, of course, during the 18th century. But you can still find these a lot in the homes that are standing. So a lot of times what this is referred to now, this African spirituality and descending from the enslaved time, is you'll hear it referred to as hoodoo. But there's a kind of a difference between the traditional African-American hoodoo and what is called a modern or a snake oil hoodoo complex. And Katrina Hazard-Donald in 2013 wrote this book called Mojo Working, in which she kind of compares what the old traditional hoodoo looks like compared to the modern complex. And her definition of hoodoo is an herbal healing, supernatural controlling, spiritual folk tradition of the African Americans in the United States. And hoodoo, like music, like dance, it's an evolving practice. So it adapts to its environment and to its circumstance. It's heavily rooted in nature, spiritual powers, honoring the ancestors. a lot of people interchange it with voodoo. It's not quite voodoo. It's kind of they are linked, but they're kind of a distant. It's kind of a distant cousin to voodoo. But the practice does evolve from common ancestors. But I think what's really important in looking at this slide, looking at the old traditional hoodoo, you have things like midwives, conjurers, root workers, spiritualists, and these were extremely important to the African American identity, especially in those early times of enslavement. And what unfortunately happens here, and which happens with a lot of kind of cultural practices, is begins to become exploited. And the hoodoo did evolve, and it didn't mix with Native American and European customs, but at the core kind of heart of it is retain the African spirituality. So it's certainly not fair to lump the two together. And you can see at the bottom right some of those kind of money-making modern day hoodoo, and there's that cross mark again on both of those. They take these practices and kind of exploit them. But this is, I'm just going to end here with this. It's a very short video, kind of continuing that talk about these practices coming from Africa and traditional hoodoo versus modern hoodoo. And it's important to just kind of keep it in mind that these were practices that were primarily African descent, and while they did change, that's an important aspect to kind of focus on. So let me just play this.
Let me start this piece by stating my stance on the hoodoo tradition. It has always been and will always be an African practice. The amalgamation of diverse West African cultures that were forced to work together against the common enemy is at the very core, root, and fruit of root work and conjure. To oversimplify it into a combination of African, Native American, and European concepts is misleading and unfair to the legacy of the practice. Conjure and root work was our natural way brought with us during the transatlantic slave trade. It served as a protection for slaves suffering all manner of abuse and trying to find a way to cope with their unfortunate circumstances. Yes, African slaves did come in contact with Native Americans and took pieces from their traditions because they knew of herbs that were unfamiliar to us, since we were used to working with different natural items. Yes, after World War I, Europeans moseyed their culture vulture asses over to our practice to add in and take away, but nothing of their influence bears witness to any claim they can make of adding anything of significance to hoodoo besides the Psalms and use of the Bible, which is a forced inclusion into the heritage of root work that we had already created.
So that's all I have from these slides. I just wanted to end this by saying, these things that are marked that I can't say for certain are necessarily linked to this hoodoo religion or spirituality, but I think the main message here is that is it kind of adopting a new philosophy towards interpreting slavery. We to stop treating slavery as a static kind of uniform institution, and I think we've made a lot of great steps in identifying, interpreting slavery, especially in the North, but the next step would be for historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, descendants of African culture to really seek new ways to shed light on these stories and unfold their stories through their lives. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe, so much. Another example of the new findings and research going on right in our state. And we want to go right to our final presentation, which is on the Scarlet and Black Project at Rutgers. Our two presenters are Dr. Alexandria Russell, who is the Scarlet and Black Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of History at Rutgers University. She received her PhD in history from the University of South Carolina and earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Bachelor of Science in Secondary Education from the College of Charleston in 2009. Her book project, Sight Seen and Unseen, Mapping African-American Women's Public Memorialization, is a national study that examines the evolution of African-American women's public commemorations in the United States from the late 19th century to the present. She's the recipient of a W.E.B. Du Bois Center Postdoctoral Fellowship, a Digital Humanities Summer Institute Scholarship, and a Rose Library Research Fellowship to support her research. Alexandria enjoys engaging with community partners right here in New Jersey in her role with the Scarlet and Black Project that recovers the multicultural history of Rutgers University. And our second presenter is Dr. Jesse Baker. He's the digital archivist for the Scarlet and Black Project at the Rutgers Center for Historical Analysis. He holds a PhD in history from Rutgers. His research for Scarlet and Black Volume 1 brought to light the stories of 24 enslaved individuals whose lives were intertwined with Rutgers' early history. We're excited to hear from both of you. And Dr. Russell will just ask you to unmute.
Of course, sorry about that. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you so much to the New Jersey Historical Commission. It's been such a pleasure to work with all the organizers, and it's an honor to be among such an esteemed panel. I'm really excited to be here and looking forward to our discussion today. So the Scarlet and Black Project began in 2015, around the time that Rutgers was preparing to celebrate its 250th year. When then Chancellor Rich Edwards asked Black students about the monumental event, they noted that they did not see themselves in the history of the university. That sparked a serious inquiry into the history of enslaved Black people at Rutgers. Since that time, the project has blossomed into a dynamic, multifaceted initiative that has added greatly, not only to the history of the university, but also to the history of New Jersey. Today, I'm going to share a brief overview of the Scarlet and Black Project by highlighting our scholarship and research, our public history, and our community engagement. Then our project's digital archivist, Dr. Jesse Baker, will take a deeper dive into our digital archive by illustrating a few aspects of the research. So our project is chaired by two esteemed historians whose research spans several centuries and has been recognized with the highest honors of the profession. Dr. Deborah Gray White and Dr. Marissa Fuentes are the chairs of the Scarlet and Black Project and have edited 3 volumes that trace the multicultural history of Rutgers. Under their leadership, graduate and undergraduate students have contributed outstanding articles that comprise the chapters in 3 books. As a signature moniker of the project's research, all 3 volumes, which you can see here, together trace the dispossession of land, the enslaved people who lived in New Brunswick and both literally and figuratively helped to build the university, the first African-American students to attend the university, and the major student protest movements of the latter half of the 20th century. So Volume 1, Slavery and Dispossession in Rutgers History, discusses how Queens College, the original name of Rutgers until 1825, was formed through the dispossession of the Lenni Lenape and greatly benefited from the wealth generated by slavery. This volume focuses on enslaved Black people in the New Brunswick area, including, as you can see here, Ukafa Groniafa, who was enslaved by the Frelinghuysen family that was heavily involved in the founding and the operation of Queens College. This volume also notes how other founding families were involved with enslavement, including the Hardenbergs, who enslaved Sojourner Truth and her family. One of the early public history initiatives that came out of our project was the naming of the Sojourner Truth Apartments on College Avenue in recognition of Sojourner Truth's ties to the university and the university's ties to slavery. Our Volume 2, Constructing Race and Gender at Rutgers, 1865 to 1945, highlights the forerunner generation, or the first African-American students to attend the university. The articles in this volume emphasize that the first African-American students at Rutgers had major triumphs while encountering the challenges of a campus culture embedded with racism. Here you see one of the most notable African-American graduates from the university, Paul Robeson, who was the second African-American to graduate in 1919. He is in his football gear here, a sport in which he excelled, but he was also quite talented off the field, as we all know. The first African-American to graduate from Rutgers in 1892 was James Dixon Carr, who is pictured here all the way to the right. In the center is Julia Baxter Bates, who this volume highlights along with other of the first African-American women to attend Douglass College, which eventually became a part of Rutgers. And our volume 3, Making Black Lives Matter at Rutgers, 1945 to 2020. This volume will be released this spring and is the culmination of the published works of the Scarlet and Black Project. This volume highlights the changing demographics of the university as it began to admit masses of students of color. Unlike the forerunner generation that comprised just a handful of other Black students, the students of the 1960s and the 1970s had a larger cadre of students to organize with. Their organizing tradition inspired several generations throughout the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. Volume 3 illustrates the impact of these student protest movements that ranged from advocating for African American and Puerto Rican studies departments, the fight to end apartheid, and even movements that called university leadership to task. Here you see pictured students from BOS, which was the Black Organization of Students, during one of the university's most notable protests at Rutgers Newark, and a picture from a multiracial anti-apartheid protest during the 1980s. The last picture you see is of the first African-American professor at Rutgers, William Neal Brown, who is also prominently featured in this third volume, along with a contextual analysis of our first African-American president, Dr. Jonathan Holloway. So as you can see, the scholarship of the Scarlet and Black Project is vast and illuminating. It is in depth, and it is truly a tribute to all those who had previously been marginalized or overlooked in previous historical narratives. It has inspired a wide range of public history initiatives and community engagement. Here in the center, you see pictured a historical marker of Will's Way with our project chairs, Dr. Deborah Gray White to the left and Dr. Marissa Fuentes to the right. This marker honors an enslaved man named Will, who helped to build Queens College, as well as all the other nameless enslaved people who were impacted by the university. This is the first of several more markers that will be coming this year, this spring. Our project has also been involved with a digitization project with Mount Zion AME Church, who is featured in our volume 2 and is now a part of our digital archive, scarletandblackproject.com. Lastly, I want to encourage everyone to download our mobile app. It's called Scarlet and Black Project, and it is available on all Apple and Android devices. You can take a virtual Scarlet and Black tour of the New Brunswick campus, as well as learn more about what I've discussed here today through some fascinating exhibitions that we have online. Our project is rooted in the history of slavery at Rutgers, and it has flourished over the last several years. It has been a pleasure to present to you today, and now I pass the torch to my colleague, Dr. Jessie Baker. Thank you so much.
Right. Hi, everybody. My name is Jessie Baker, and I am the digital archivist for the Scarlet and Black Project at Rutgers University. And I'm going to take over for the second half of our presentation. So today I want to tell you about the Scarlet and Black Digital Archive. Our website is scarletandblackproject.com, and I encourage you to check it out and share it with history enthusiasts and educators in New Jersey. Our digital archive is a publicly accessible educational resource, and it serves as a companion to our 3 books. And by the way, you can also read our first book for free as an ebook. Just go to our website, click on books in the corner at the top of the page, and then next to the book cover, you will see a button to access the ebook. So that's how you can get the free book. Now, with the Scarlet and Black Digital Archive, we're working to digitize a wide range of historical documents and make them accessible for people who are researching and teaching Black history in New Jersey. Our digital collections include primary sources about the history of slavery in New Jersey. So these include slavery-era newspaper clippings, like runaway slave ads and slave sale advertisements. We also have birth records of enslaved children in Middlesex County in the early 19th century. We'll have manumission records for Middlesex County, as well as letters and slave sale receipts and accounting records. Now, many of these items that we have pertain to the men who were connected with Rutgers University, but that's only a portion of the documents. We're also very much interested in documenting local Black history. So we have many items in the archive that are not specifically connected with Rutgers. For example, of this collection, the African Association of New Brunswick, this is the first Black institution in Middlesex County, and it was active from 1817 to 1824. So we are digitizing and transcribing their records as well. Now, as we move into the 20th century, we have a lot more visual materials like photographs, and we have exhibits about some of the earliest African-American alumni, both men and women who attended the university. And I'm sharing images of some of these historical documents and photographs with you today. And everything that I'm showing you, you can find on our website. Now, before I started working on the digital archive, I first got involved with the Scarlet and Black Project as a researcher when we were writing our first book about slavery and Rutgers University. And I worked on this essay called His Name Was Will. And I want to talk a little bit about that research experience. When my collaborators and I set out to write this book, our goal was to examine and fully acknowledge the role of slavery in the founding of Rutgers University. We looked around at the names on our campus buildings. We looked in Rutgers history books that tell the story of our founding, and we made this long list of names of wealthy white men who established and supported the school. These elite men gave land and money to the school because they wanted to make sure that their own sons could get a college education. And so our question was, which of these men enslaved, bought, sold, and exploited Black people? Now, we knew that slavery was central to New Jersey's early development, especially in places that were colonized by the Dutch. Now, the English in New Jersey certainly had slaves too, but if you look at the historically Dutch settlements in New Jersey, you will find a higher concentration of enslaved people there. And Rutgers was established by ministers from the Dutch Reformed Church, and many of the early students are going to come from Dutch families in New Jersey and New York. So it came as no surprise that virtually all of the men who were important to the early history of Rutgers College were slaveholders. Some of them employed 1 or 2 enslaved people in their home for domestic labor. Some owned plantations in the Caribbean with hundreds of slaves. And some made fortunes in the transatlantic slave trade. Here are some of the types of documents that helped us confirm their connections to slavery. This is a letter from our first college president, Jacob Hardenberg, who has a building on our campus named after him, Hardenberg Hall. He wrote this letter to his father, Johannes Hardenberg, in 1777 during the Revolutionary War. Now, this letter was actually written in Dutch, and it was translated by archivist Helene van Rossum. And you can see both the Dutch and English transcriptions on our digital archive. Now, in this letter, President Hardenberg mentions an enslaved man who was working in his home, but he does not say the man's name. He refers to the man simply as the Negro. Here we also see an item from a local newspaper called The Guardian or New Brunswick Advertiser. This is from the year 1800, and it is an advertisement for the sale of a 35-year-old Black woman. This advertisement was placed by the president's son, Jacob Hardenberg Jr., who himself served as the secretary of the board of trustees of the college at the time when he placed this ad. Now, again, we see here that the Black woman's name is not actually printed in the paper. Sources like this letter and this advertisement, they give us evidence that the college's officers and benefactors held people in bondage. But many of these documents do not give us the names of the enslaved people involved. So that's not enough. We know that if we're going to talk about Rutgers and Black history, we have to find their names. We have to say their names. So the bigger challenge, the more important challenge for us was finding the names of the enslaved people whose life and labor helped create this university so that we could add their stories and their names to the university's history. So for example, one man whose name we were able to add to Rutgers history was named Will. Unfortunately, we don't know his last name, but we know that his first name was Will. And in September of 1808, Will labored at a construction site in New Brunswick. He was laying the foundation for the first permanent building for the college. This building still stands on our campus today, and it is known as the Old Queen's Building. And it houses the office of the Chancellor of New Brunswick and other top administrators. We know about Will's story because of accounting books that show that he earned over $45 for his labor as a mason on this construction site. Now, this was good money in that day, but Will did not get to keep his money. Instead, the college paid the money to Will's white master, Dr. Jacob Dunham, who was a physician in New Brunswick and a supporter of the college. For years, Will labored all around New Brunswick, doing masonry work on construction sites, hauling heavy loads of sand, and ringing bells at auctions. Every day of Will's life, his master got richer and richer because of Will's labor. Finding Will's name helped us tell Will's story, and it also helped us to create a space on campus that we could mark to honor him. Now, one of the collections that we created in the Scarlet and Black Digital Archive is a collection of slavery-era newspaper clippings. And these clippings include notices about Black people who escaped or tried to emancipate themselves by running away. And usually there is a reward posted for their return. And you can also explore these items on our map. These runaway ads almost always tell us the name of the person who escaped. And I like to use these primary sources for teaching because they tell us about resistance against the oppression of slavery. And they tell us about people who took matters into their own hands and tried to free themselves. And here is an example that we have of a notice for a $10 reward from the newspaper, The Guardian. This is about a young Black woman named Rachel. She was 20 years old. Rachel ran away from her master, and then she was captured and placed into Middlesex County Jail in downtown New Brunswick on George Street. And then Rachel broke out of jail and escaped. Now, we don't know if Rachel got away for good or if she was captured again. But what is remarkable is that Rachel escaped on January 15th, 1814. And this advertisement that you're looking at was running in the newspaper in March of the following year. That's 14 months later. So hopefully, this might mean that Rachel really got away and found her way to a life of freedom. I want to wrap up by just mentioning a couple of our digital exhibits about local history in New Brunswick in the 1920s. This is a really important time in New Jersey Black history. It is the first wave of the Great Migration, and there's an influx of Black migrants from the South to northern cities. And thousands of these migrants come to settle in New Jersey. So there is a lot of change and upheaval in this period. And we have exhibits that highlight two organizations that emerge in New Brunswick at this time. These are sort of opposing forces. On one hand, you have the rise of the KKK in New Jersey, including a local chapter in New Brunswick that was called Rutgers Klan number 44. So you can check out our exhibit, Ku Klux Klan in New Brunswick, to learn more about that. On the other hand, you have the emergence of the New Brunswick branch of the NAACP. So check out our exhibit called NAACP in New Brunswick to learn about the organization and their remarkable campaign to save a Black man named Silas Parmore from being lynched. It's an incredible story, and I hope you will check it out.
Well, it's my pleasure to thank all of our presenters this afternoon and to turn it over, I think, to Greer Luce of the Historical Commission staff, who's going to help us with questions. And Greer, I think we also have one raised hand as well. So, and I'll turn it over to you, Greer, to pull up the first question.
Sure. So it looks like we only have one question at the moment, and I believe this question is specifically for Reverend Lundy. And that question is from Jan Meerworth. How is it that you were able to identify 313 burials? Were you able to identify them through ground penetrating radar, or is there a listing in the church records?
Thank you so much for that question. Actually, there is the sexton's book. He kept impeccable records. So that's one resource. And also, when someone was buried, there was usually someone who actually paid for that burial. So through those records, there was research that was done. So those were the two sources. When I first came to the campus, I was told that there was a document that had 313 names listed. And so that's how you hear the number 313. After that, I found out that there were actually more than 313, potentially 384, and potentially even more than that. So that's how we know that there are at least 313. We have a spreadsheet with 117 first and last names. Then we have some first names, some last names, and then some unknowns. So part of our research, as Jesse shared with us, it is so important to call their names. And that's part of our work, to identify their names, but also more than that, to tell their stories. These are people just like you and I, who lived lives, who had stories to tell and lessons to teach us even today. So it's important to do that work. And I really appreciate those who actually kept the records for whatever their purpose and reason was. For us today, it gives us some clues of how we can identify them. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Reverend Lundy. And Sarah, I think you have a few questions of your own, but I also just wanted to thank all of the speakers today. I forgot to mention that before I jumped in. This was a wonderful program.
Absolutely. And I think because our time is limited, I'm gonna go straight to this question and ask each of you to answer it, if you would, please. And that is, what advice would you give to history professionals and public historians seeking to recenter interpretations at their sites and organizations on underrepresented narratives? So we're looking for your best advice for our colleagues who are with us today. Anybody want to volunteer to go first?
I'll give it a shot.
Thank you, Dr. Russell.
I'll let Reverend Lundy go first.
Oh, okay, good. Pastor Lundy, we'd love to hear from you.
My answer is short. I think to do an assessment, I would suggest to do an assessment of who is around your table, who's already involved in the work that you're doing, to do an assessment of the community that you're serving and see who's lacking around your table, and make sure you include people who are involved in the community that you're doing the research with, to include them in the work that you're doing so that you can hear their voice, so that you can hear their concerns. I think would be one way to really make sure that that you have an authentic witness, and that you're actually serving the needs of the community that you're trying to tell the story of.
Thank you so much, Pastor Lundy. And Dr. Russell, did you have another thought to add?
Yes, I mean, I totally agree. Community engagement is key. Oftentimes, communities are overlooked in this type of work. And so it's important to, again, have a diverse group of people around the table. But I would also say to ask different questions. What are the questions that haven't been asked or answered before? Those questions, as Dr. Baker illustrated, can lead you on a beautiful journey of finding out new information. And so it's important not to ask the same questions because you'll get the same results. But when you ask new questions and you have a diverse constituency there to answer those questions, now you have the beginning of a beautiful project.
Thank you so much. Now we do have two raised hands. I'm just noticing over here. And the first, I believe, was Rosemary Fitzgerald. Rosemary, can you unmute and ask your question? Maybe I have to, oops. Okay. Rosemary, I think you now can ask your question if you would like.
I didn't mean to. I touched it by accident, but I just want to say I'm from South Jersey, and our town is next to Lawnside, and we had slaves in our town that were owned by Quakers, so they were freed in the 1700s, but they still lived here, and they're buried in an unmarked slave cemetery. So that was, what I was most interested in, and then recording more than just their name. That's all we have is just their names. Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. And we do, I think, have a couple other questions very quickly. Greer, do you want to share those?
Sure. So the first question we have here is from Vicky C. And that is, what are your thoughts regarding other such cemeteries across New Jersey? Where might the enslaved have been laid to rest? So relevant to the comment we just received as well.
Yes.
I know that the New Jersey Afro-American Genealogical and Historical Society is doing some research on, at least one of their members is doing some research on cemeteries in New Jersey, and has begun to develop a robust list. So that might be a contact if you're interested in knowing. She's actually doing that type of research now. And that's the Afro-American, the New Jersey chapter of the Afro-American Genealogical and Historical Society.
Thank you so much, Pastor Lundy. And I think there was another question, but Dr. Baker may have already typed an answer to it from Karen Favarzani. Should we share that one? She asked for Dr. Baker, how did you come to start your project about the connection of Rutgers' original founders to slavery, and where did you conduct your research?
Well, our research, a lot of the work that we did was conducted at the Special Collections and University Archives at Rutgers, New Brunswick at the Alexander Library, which those collections have a lot of holdings about specifically Middlesex County. So a lot of the Middlesex County records for things like birth records, manumissions, they are actually held there. But we also used a lot of what you would think of as traditional social history sources like wills and tax records, census records for the people that we knew were the founders of the university. So a lot of those records are in Trenton at the state archives as well.
Well, I am so sorry to say that we have come to the end of our time together. Obviously, there is so much more to discover and to share in this just rich area of African American history in our state of New Jersey. So I want to once again thank all of our presenters. I also want to remind all of you that the New Jersey Historical Commission has a very active grant program, and we do have, in fact, 2 grant rounds coming up. One will be for project grants. So if you represent an organization that's thinking about tackling a project in this area, we would love to receive a proposal for you. We do have grant workshops coming up. In March, I believe, let me see if I can quickly tell you the dates. I believe, yes, they are going to be on March 10th at noon and March 12th. I'm sorry, yes, both at noon. So March 10th and March 12th at noon are our 2 upcoming project grant programs for the Historical Commission. We also have a round of grants coming up for the New Jersey Cultural Trust, which will be focused on institutional and financial stabilization. So we will have workshops coming up for those as well. Please do check our website and follow us on social media, where we put out information on all of that on a regular basis. So I can't tell you how sad I am to say goodbye to our presenters, to bring this to an end, because it has been such a fascinating program. Thank you, all of our speakers, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We look forward to more gatherings like this one to share important new research. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.